Hi, I'm Kelsey Romeo-Stuppy, Managing Attorney at Action on Smoking and Health. This webinar today is going to teach you some practical applications of human rights for tobacco control. It's intended for California advocates, but could be useful for many others. So let me start sharing my screen here, and we will get started. Okay. So again, practical applications of human rights to tobacco control. I'm Kelsey Romeo-Stuppy, Managing Attorney at Action on Smoking and Health. There's my contact information. Please feel free to get in touch with any questions. So first, why is tobacco a human rights issue? First, everyone has a right to life and to health. This is documented in human rights treaties, very well established. Governments have the duty to enforce those rights. So we're talking about what governments need to do, not necessarily corporations. So the next step is that governments therefore have the duty to protect their citizens from those corporations. So even if corporations don't have a human rights responsibility, the governments do, and they must step in to protect people from the harms of the tobacco industry and tobacco. The next part is that if they don't, there are legal remedies available at the international, regional, and national level. The Ruggie principles are a human rights principle in which we understand three things: that human rights are intended to protect, respect, and remedy. So this is another way to say what I said on the previous slide. Governments are required to protect citizens from the tobacco industry. The industry should respect human rights norms. And if they don't, there are mechanisms and processes to deal with that. The United States is a little bit unique when it comes to human rights treaties because human rights treaties have the full force of law in the US and in most places. The US is really hesitant to ratify human rights treaties. So a large number of human rights treaties that have been ratified by most of the countries of the world, the United States has not ratified. So the US has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Again, these are very widely accepted around the world. I think there are 3 countries that have not satisfied the convention or ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the US is definitely unique in this. That said, the US has ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. I'm going to talk quite a bit more about CERD later, so I just wanted to emphasize that one now too. This is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The convention is called ICERD, and the committee that is responsible for managing it is called CERD. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but the US has ratified this one, so it has the same standard of law that any US law does. So this is equal to the Constitution or any other federal law. The CERD convention includes a statement on the right to public health. It's about preventing discrimination based on race, and included in that is protection on the right to public health. So this is definitely a tool we can use for tobacco control. So I want to talk a little bit about what you can do with these treaties. So we often encourage partners in countries around the world to report when these human rights treaties are coming up. Because the United States has not ratified a lot of them, that isn't as much of a tool in the United States. But the language is there, the obligation is there, and we can use this language and this obligation to promote our local advocacy. It goes a long way to tell a local council person that not protecting people from tobacco is violating their human rights. That's something that we need to do more of. So we're going to talk more about that too. First, I wanted to give a success story about using human rights at the local level. Many of you will remember that the United States backed out of a major climate agreement under the Trump administration. a lot of people, a lot of governments, a lot of mayors and governors and people like that disagreed with that decision. And there was a huge movement in the US to ratify this at the local level or to commit to international environmental pledges. There was like Mayors for Climate Change is a big organization. There were several like that where cities and localities decided, even if the federal government isn't going to do this, we're going to do it anyway. So that's a great example of how, despite the fact that the federal government is not a part of it, we can still use international law to affect local change in the US. This is another example. CEDAW is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and almost every country in the world has ratified this one as well, except the US. So there's an organization called Cities for CEDAW that has encouraged local governments to take a pledge to uphold the principles laid out in CEDAW. And interestingly, the mayor of Pittsburgh used principles of CEDAW to pass a local law on domestic violence. It's a Cities for CEDAW city, and he used this international language to pass a local ordinance. So I think that's a great example of how effective international law can be in the local level. And then there's sort of the other way, the other side of this, right? How do we use human rights to benefit public health internationally? What's the example of how advocacy has worked at the international level? And I think the HIV/AIDS movement is a perfect example. Local advocates decided that the UN should be tackling the HIV/AIDS issue. There had not been a lot of attention given to this issue at the UN level, but they brought it up again and again. They ended up with a high-level meeting on HIV/AIDS, and there was actually a section of the UN created to work on AIDS issues. So local advocacy has really impacted the way that the international community views HIV/AIDS, and that they should be taking it as an international issue well within their human rights jurisdiction. So that started from a couple local advocates that decided that it was important that the international community get involved. I wanted to give another example of using a human rights body to affect local change. Argentina is one of very few countries that has not ratified the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the Tobacco Treaty. The United States is another. We also have not ratified this. But some of our partners in Argentina decided to submit a report to the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and ask CEDAW to encourage the government of Argentina to implement the FCTC, the Tobacco Treaty. So we have advocates asking a committee to ask the government to implement another treaty. And the committee did. They said to the government of Argentina, we really think you need to be doing this. You need to be ratifying and implementing the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control to protect women in your country from the harms of tobacco. So that's a big success story of using the human rights bodies to achieve local change. Now I want to talk a little bit about how all of those things sort of come together. In the US, there's been a big movement recently to ban menthol in cigarettes. As I'm sure many of you know, menthol advertising has been predatory to the Black community for generations. And the FDA has the ability to ban menthol, but has not taken action to do so. So first, there's an example of an advertisement, which is actually fairly recent. It was mailed to me, so I know how recent it was. That's about a year or two old. And you can clearly see that it's targeted to young African Americans to make Newports seem like they fit into that sort of perception or lifestyle. So in order to take action on menthol, we at ASH partnered with the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, and we sued the FDA and said, you should be taking action on menthol to save the lives of millions and especially the lives of African Americans. While that lawsuit was rolling out, the wheels of justice turned slowly. We also decided to take this into the international community. So we targeted ICERD, the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, because of the targeted advertising to African Americans. We thought this was an issue that ICERD absolutely should be looking into. People are being targeted because of their race, and it is negatively affecting their health. So that clearly falls into their jurisdiction. So in addition to the complaint with the FDA, we filed a complaint with CERD asking them to follow up with the US government and make sure that the US government was going to take action on this issue. I'm sure many of you know, in April of this year, the FDA announced that they are going to take steps to ban menthol. We have a ways to go still. They announced that they're going to announce a rule. We have some time before the rule comes out, and then there will probably be legal challenges from the tobacco industry. So we're going to continue the pressure from the international community as well, because we want the FDA to know that the international community is watching this and is very concerned about the negative health impacts of menthol cigarettes. So that's just a really nice example of how sort of the local advocacy around menthol, particularly in places like California, the national level advocacy against the FDA, and the international advocacy with CERD have come together and had a great impact on menthol cigarettes. So what can you do? Internationally, you can do something like submit a report to CERD. I think more effective at this point, because there's been a report submitted already, is to create an advocacy campaign. Most people who smoke don't view themselves as human rights victims. And I think that's something that we could change, and we should bring up in the international community, that these people are victims of human rights abuses. There are also opportunities to make oral statements in front of human rights bodies regularly. So we track those at ASH. We would love to have more local partners involved. So please contact me if you'd be interested in doing that. Locally, we should be using human rights language. This is particularly interesting around social justice right now. The US often uses the term social justice instead of human rights. And I think sometimes they're interchangeable, but we should certainly be using more human rights language. We should be talking about the right to health and the right to life. Tobacco companies are violating people's right to health. That's a very strong statement that I don't think that advocates are using frequently enough. With that, we should create an advocacy campaign and encourage the community to understand that concept. It's also very persuasive language to decision makers. A local tobacco ordinance that's going to protect someone's human rights, I think, is maybe a stronger argument than a local tobacco ordinance that's dealing with secondhand smoke in outdoor parks or something. Not because the content is any different, but just the framing. Human rights issues sound big and important, and local council members want to pass things that sound big and important. So I think it's really a great idea to include that human rights language. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one. Let's see if we can go back. I just wanted to take a moment to highlight all the intersections happening here. I mentioned with menthol, sort of the intersection with social justice, and I think that's really important to think about. The social justice movement in the United States, as you all know, has really taken off in the past year. And I think it's essential that we tie tobacco in with these things. Tobacco is a social justice issue. It negatively impacts the health of vulnerable populations. So we absolutely should be talking about that. We should be talking about it in the context of COVID-19. Tobacco has negative impacts on the outcomes of COVID-19. So we need to be discussing that when we're talking about the environment. Tobacco is negative for the environment as well. There's lots of ways to break out of our silo of tobacco control and bring it in to bigger, broader issues so that we can bolster all of these issues at the same time. And I think it's important not to think of tobacco as its own unique issue that isn't impacted by other things. Tobacco is unique. It's the only product that kills people as when used as intended, but it is a part of all of these other issues. So it's important to think about. This is just another example of all of the intersections between tobacco and health and COVID and human rights. So I've mentioned this a couple times now, but this is a definition from the UN of social justice and of human rights. So social justice is an underlying principle for peaceful and prosperous coexistence within and among nations. We advance social justice when we remove barriers that people face because of gender, age, ethnicity, religion, culture, or disability. This is also a definition of human rights from the UN. These universal rights are inherent to us all, regardless of nationality, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. And here's what I think is the most important part. All human rights are indivisible and interdependent. That means that one set of rights cannot be enjoyed fully without the other. So if tobacco is a barrier to human rights, it's also a barrier to social justice. If tobacco is a barrier to the right to development, it's also a barrier to the right to health. These things are all indivisible and interdependent, and it's just so important that we address tobacco in that and help to solve that and make a step forward for both social justice and human rights. So how do we use human rights to advance public health? That's a really broad question that's very different at each level. At the international level, we have a conference of the parties every 2 years on the tobacco treaty. And this slide focuses mostly on that. You can support the decision that's coming, hopefully, on human rights at the COP. But we can also use the human rights arguments for advocacy. And I think that's the part that's more relevant to local advocates right now. Human rights arguments are relevant in tobacco litigation. We used human rights arguments in our litigation against the FDA. That's very important. They're important in reporting back to these tobacco treaties. They're important at the Human Rights Council. They're important in international mechanisms, but they're also important in local mechanisms. It's important to use the human rights arguments so that we can start from the local level and work our way all the way to the international using the same language and the same arguments. And over here on this side, it's just a highlight again of how many rights tobacco infringes on. It's so many. This is a tool that I wanted to highlight for all of you. It's an ongoing human rights hub that we maintain on the ASH website. The goal of this hub was to make it so that tobacco control advocates have at their fingertips all the human rights arguments they need, and that human rights advocates have at their fingertips all the tobacco information they need. So it's constantly being updated. There's actually a section on CERD that isn't on the screenshot that's been recently included. We have some California specific arguments for using human rights arguments to further menthol bans. So please go there and check this out. If there's something you'd like to see on the hub or something you'd like to add to the hub, please feel free to email it to me and we'd be happy to add that for you. There are also ways to sign up to get involved. As I mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities to intervene at the international level, and we would love to have more local advocates participating in that. The action alerts are broader alerts from ASH, just sort of this is what's happening. The Human Rights and Tobacco Control Network is more intended to be a sort of an advocacy group where we share ideas and brainstorm and things like that. That is a closed group, but if you're interested in joining, please contact me and we can make sure you're not from the tobacco industry and see about getting you added to the list. Thank you very much for your time. I would love to talk to you more about human rights and tobacco control. Here is my contact information, and you can also follow ASH on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of those things. We would love your feedback on this program and what you would like to see in the future. There's a survey link here, and we will also include it in the Zoom notes as well. So thank you so much for your time, and please feel free to contact me with any questions you might have. Thanks so much.